All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Poly Talk Dartmouth Review event tonight. On behalf of the Heritage Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you here and thank you all for coming. Just as a brief plug for Poly Talk before we get going, we ordered a pretty good amount of food, so please feel free to indulge yourself in your tuition dollars, so please. And also, just one more thing, Poly Talk will be finishing our term next Monday, actually in this room from 5 to 6. We will have a Q&A session with the Dean of the College, Charlotte Johnson. She's agreed to speak with our group and take questions from the audience, so I would highly advise you to come out to that event. It will be something pretty worthwhile. I'm now going to turn it over to the editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth Review, Sterling Peer.
Great, but I'm not speaking. Anyway, thank you all for coming in tonight. This is the second such event. This is the second talk in the Liberty Lecture Series. Tonight we are fortunate to have David Azerrad of the Heritage Foundation's B. Kenneth Simon Center for Politics and Understanding. Did I got that right? Excellent. Okay, I was scared to death I was going to mess that up. But I had the good fortune to hear Mr. Azerrad speak several times this past summer as a member of the Heritage Foundation's Young Leadership Program, and that is in fact the internship program at the Heritage Foundation. Absolutely wonderful experience. I'd recommend it to anybody in this room. And just before we get David the floor real quick, Ms. Fitzenberry, I believe you had a few words about that?
Great.
All right.
Well, thanks Sterling and Tyler. I'm so excited to be able to come back to campus. This is only our second time coming out to Dartmouth, and it's always a great opportunity to get to partner with Poly Talk and Dartmouth Review and get the opportunity to speak with all of you. So before we dive in, I see some new faces in the crowd, so I think it's really important to talk for a minute about what we're all about at Heritage before we focus in on a particular policy topic. I'm sure all of you have heard that Heritage is a think tank or public policy research organization, but our mission at Heritage is to formulate and promote conservative public policy. And everything we do is based on 5 core principles: limited government, individual freedom, traditional values, free enterprise, and a strong defense. So as a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, we're based on those principles, not politics. But what does that really mean? Well, it means we don't promote or not promote any political parties, any political candidates. We do unabashedly promote our ideas, and all those ideas born out of those core principles. So we're really committed to building an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. So to accomplish that, we try to provide timely and accurate research. So from looking at foreign policy questions like what should America's role in the world be, like we covered last time, to looking at things like the economy and tax policy. We really cover a wide range of issues at Heritage. You'll also see that we do short things like our blog posts to very long research papers and first principles pieces that come out of the shop that David works on. So I hope that you're really excited to dive in with us today, and with no further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague, David Azerrad.
Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at such a distinguished university. I want to begin by raising a question that I think is more fundamental than the ones that are contained in the title of my talk. And allow me to do so bluntly. Who cares? Yes, who cares? So what if the founding is racist? And so what if it isn't? So what if the founding is hopelessly outdated? And so what if it turns out that it's not some get-rich scheme for white men wearing powder wigs? The founding happened a long, long time ago. The founders are all dead and gone. You and I live in the 21st century. And aside from a few historians whose job it is to dig through musty historical records, why should anybody really care about the founding? I think we need to address this fundamental question before we proceed, as it's key to establishing the importance and the relevance of my talk tonight. So allow me to emphasize one important point from the outset. In any regime, the way that citizens understand the founding, i.e. the creation of their country, has profound political implications for the present. Now, this is true of all regimes, but it is particularly true of a regime such as ours, that was founded at a specific moment in history and and whose founders articulated clear principles to justify the establishment of the country. A quick contrast with France is revealing in this regard. The origins of the French nation are lost in the mist of time, and since their revolution, by my count, they have gone through 5 republics, 2 monarchies, 2 empires, 1 restoration of the monarchy. We, on the other hand, in America, began as a country on July 4th, 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of 1787 is still with us today. In French parlance, we are still on our first republic, if you will. Therefore, when we turn to the founding, we do so not as historians who are moved by an antiquarian curiosity for old things, but as citizens of a constitutional republic who are moved by a concern for justice, the common good, and other related political issues. So we need to be clear on this. We are posing political questions, not historical questions. Now, in doing so, of course, we need to examine the historical record, but we cannot lose sight of the political importance of these questions. So, now that I've made that point that I think is important, let's look at what I take to be the 3 most prominent charges that are leveled at the founding, and that in a certain sense preclude a return to the founding. There are many, and in the Q&A I'll be willing to entertain any other things you've heard, but by my account, these are the 3 biggest ones. The first one, which I'm sure you've heard, is that the founding is racist. So it goes a little something like this. The founders were racists, they owned slaves, and they thought blacks were subhuman. That didn't prevent some of them, i.e. Jefferson, from having sex with their slaves. More importantly, they not only failed to abolish slavery, but they legitimized this inhuman practice in a constitution that said, lo and behold, that blacks were only worth 3/5 of a human being. Secondly, the founding is unfair. Now, blacks, by any account, got the worst lot of the founding, but the founding also shortchanged women, minorities, the poor, you name it. The Constitution is fundamentally undemocratic, as it privileges the wealthy few over the many, and nothing is more indicative of this than the fact that only white males who own property could vote under the Constitution. Third, the founding is outdated. All questions of justice and fairness aside, the founding is basically obsolete. We no longer live in the 18th century. We don't drive around with horse-drawn buggies. The founding and the Constitution grew out of a world that no longer exists, and in case you haven't noticed, it ain't about to make a comeback anytime soon. Doctors no longer treat high fevers with leeches, so why are we clinging to our 18th century Constitution? And what I'd like to do this evening is address these charges one at a time. So let's begin with the first one, the racism charge. Now, to call the issue of slavery the 800-pound gorilla in the room when studying the founding is an understatement. The question of slavery looms so large over the founding in contemporary thinking, both in the academy and amongst the general public, that I think it's more accurate to say that we've moved into the gorilla's cage. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for many people, slavery is the first word that comes to mind when they hear the word founders. Similarly, Thomas Jefferson doesn't evoke the Declaration of Independence or the establishment of the University of Virginia. You hear Sally Hemings. This is also the charge that is always first used to entirely discredit the founding and to suggest that anyone who turns to it for guidance is a racist. So Sanford Levinson, has anybody heard of him? He's a big shot law professor at UT Austin. He wrote a book called Our Undemocratic Constitution. And he waits until page 4 of the introduction to tell us our 18th century ancestors had little trouble integrating slavery into their conception of a republican political order. That vision of politics is blessedly long behind us, but the Constitution is not. The following statement by MSNBC's Keith Olbermann, I think, neatly sums up the opinion of many on the founding. Quote, "Not very many of the founding fathers were evolved enough to believe that black people were actually people. The founding fathers thought they were slaves, and they fought hard to make sure they would always remain slaves. Now, I'm no fan of Keith Olbermann, and I think that his indictment is grotesque. That said, the question of slavery is a real problem when you're thinking about the founding. To put it simply, how could a nation that was, in Lincoln's immortal words at Gettysburg, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, tolerate the existence of chattel slavery? I mean, if that's not a contradiction, I don't know what is. In thinking about this question for a few years and having had to teach this in a classroom setting, I found it useful to break it down into three parts and to address it in a threefold manner. First, by looking at the principles of the founding. Secondly, by looking at the founders in their private capacities as citizens, what they did in their private lives. Third of all, by looking at the Constitution, that is, the supreme political document of the founding. So let's begin with the first one. Were the principles of the founding racist? Did the foundational ideas articulated in the Declaration of Independence only apply to whites? Did they sanction, perhaps even promote, slavery? The answer on this one is a resounding and unambiguous no. When the Declaration of Independence says all men, it means all human beings, regardless of skin color, or religion, sex, sexual orientation for that matter. Nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution are human beings classified according to race. There are no references to race in any statement of first principle. The enslavement of human beings, whether on racial grounds or not, is a fundamental violation of everything that the founding stands for. The founders knew this. In public speeches and in non-confidential letters, the point was made again and again. Slavery was fundamentally incompatible with every principle that justified American resistance to British oppression. A people that literally had defined itself by reference to the principle of equality was in flagrant and profound contradiction with itself in holding other men slaves. Now you'll say, talk is cheap, so what if they had these principles and they said that they were anti-slavery? But don't be too quick to dismiss them. The proclamation of natural human equality as the first and central, self-evident truth of the Declaration of Independence set in motion the abolitionist movement and started to yield some real results. So, if you compare the situation in 1774, so when the revolution begins, do you know how many states have slavery out of the 13 colonies? Any guesses? 13. Do you know how many abolitionist societies there are in America at the time? 0. The African slave trade is going on and thriving. If you look at the situation in 1830, slavery has practically been abolished in all the northern states. Of the 125 blacks who live in the north, only 1% were still slaves. The Northwest Ordinance has decreed slavery illegal in the upper western territories, and the African slave trade was abolished. Now, of course, in the South, slavery continued to thrive, and we had to have a civil war to resolve the issue. But there is something to be said for the proclamation of these principles and giving them the time to start to work themselves out. So, if you look at the issue of principles, it is absolutely impossible to make the argument that they were not only didn't condone slavery, that they were resolutely anti-slave. Let's look at the second one. The deeds of the founders as private citizens. Did individual founders in their private lives live up to these principles? Did Washington, Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, and the boys own slaves? Did they hold prejudicial views of blacks? The short answer on this one is pretty simple. Who cares? We turn to the principles of the founding for guidance, not to the way that individual founders conducted themselves in their private lives. We take our bearings from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, not the autobiography of Thomas Jefferson. So did Jefferson own slaves? Yes, shame on him. Did Hamilton own slaves? Never. Hamilton never owned slaves. Good for him. You know what Hamilton did do? He cheated on his wife. Does that make philandering one of the founding principles? Again, the founders are all dead and gone. The political principles which they articulated endured, and slavery most definitely was not one of these principles. What you really want to focus on is this. These guys are all dead and gone. This is still with us and passes the test. This is also still with us. We still have the Constitution in its original form with only 27 amendments. So, is the Constitution a racist document? Is it a pro-slavery document? This is what you want to focus on. Now, the first thing to keep in mind before you look at this is to remind ourselves of what the obstacles were to abolition. Today, no right-thinking person defends slavery. So you think, well, if there's slavery, you just abolish it, it's very easy. Regrettably, this was not the case at the time. So what were the obstacles that stood in the way of abolishing slavery? Well, the short answer is that the southern slave-owning states would never have ratified a constitution that outlawed slavery. In fact, they wouldn't even sign Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence because it contained a condemnation of the slave trade. To give you an idea of the importance of slavery to Southerners, consider the declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the Federal Union, proclaimed in January 1861. Quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization." This is the obstacle that the founders contended with. So what did they actually do? They compromised. They created a constitution that accepts slavery as a fait accompli, but empowers the federal government to hem it in and eventually eradicate it through a constitutional amendment. Had the founders simply taken the moral high ground and said, we will not compromise with slavery, there would have been no union, no constitution, and no possibility to ever eradicate slavery in the states where it existed. So how then does the Constitution treat slavery? First thing to notice, the words slave or slavery never appear in the Constitution. You'll say, they were hypocrites. They weren't. Slaves are referred to as other persons. And for the framers, this was important because they wanted to underscore the humanity of slaves and deny Southern claims that human beings could be property. Secondly, the Constitution makes clear that slavery is a creation of the states, that the federal government is forced to deal with, but it is not an institution that is officially sanctioned by the Constitution. Therefore, when slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, not a single word of the Constitution had to be changed. Now, what about this infamous 3/5 clause? Surely you've heard of this one, right? You guys have heard of this one? This clause, contrary to what the New York Times stated in a pompous editorial just a few months ago, does not stipulate that blacks were worth 60% of a white person. It says that for purposes of representation in Congress and for taxation, each state counts up all its citizens, and it then adds up 3/5 of all other persons. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, black citizens, blacks who were not enslaved, and there were many at the time, counted for one for purposes of representation. Secondly, it's the South that wanted to count black slaves as one. Not because they liked black people, because they wanted to inflate their interest in Congress and have a stronger pro-slavery representation in Congress. It's the North that wanted to count the slaves as zero, not because they hated slaves, because they wanted to undercut Southern slaveholding power in Congress. So what did they do? They compromised. That's what you do in politics. And they came up with this 3/5 number. It has nothing to do with the moral worth of black people. It is about the tricky question of representation in Congress. And it ultimately weakened Southern power in Congress. What else does the Constitution do? It gives Congress the power to outlaw the slave trade within 20 years of ratification of the Constitution. And the Congress did that on the very first day it could, January 1st, 1808. Jefferson signed the bill into law. It gave Congress the power to ban in all new territories and states both slavery and the importation of slaves. It gave Congress the power to tax slave owners to make it unprofitable. And of course, the Constitution could be amended. The hope was that you'd confine it to the states in which it existed, prevent its spread, and eventually garner a 3/4 majority of states that would pass a constitutional amendment to declare it unconstitutional. The Constitution, in the words of Frederick Douglass, the great 19th century abolitionist, is a glorious document of liberty. Now, what have I tried to show you by going through these charges? Is that the standard take on the question of slavery, race, and the founding completely fails to do justice to the complexity of the issue and does not acknowledge the very real efforts that were made to undermine slavery. Furthermore, the excessive focus on this, what the founders were doing in their private capacities, completely misses the point. As I've told you, and as I'll repeat again, the founders are all dead and gone. We look to the principles. Now, this is not meant to whitewash the founding or to say that all was fine and dandy for the slaves. It's meant to encourage you to properly think about this and not just dismiss it offhand. So certain questions that I think you can and should be asking yourselves is, could they have pushed harder? Did they perhaps compromise too quickly? Why did they wait 20 years to ban the slave trade? Why not 10? And they settled on this 3/5 number. Why didn't they push harder and make it 1/5? But what you cannot do is complacently dismiss the founding and the Constitution as being racist and pro-slavery. If you're concerned with justice, you don't need to look any further than the founding. And don't take my word for it. I'm sure you guys have heard of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, right? It's probably the greatest speech of the 20th century. And we all remember the dream, right? It's a dream about an America where we all get together and everyone's rights are respected. What people tend to forget are, according to Martin Luther King, the origins of that dream. He says it is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. It is, I quote, embedded in the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Contrast this with critics of the founding, who today are telling you that the founders is racist. What they're basically doing is siding with the Supreme Court in what is arguably the worst decision it ever rendered. Anybody have any idea what that might be? Dred Scott. And what did the Supreme Court say in Dred Scott? That black people, by virtue of their skin color, could not be citizens of the United States. And that when the Declaration of Independence said all men, it meant all white men. So on the question of race, slavery, and the founding, the question is, do you want to side with Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass, or do you want to side with Justice Taney and the other pro-slavery segregationist justices? I would suggest that if you fall in the latter camp, there's a problem with your outlook. Let's look at the second charge. Now, this one is not as prominent as the racism slavery one, but it is sprawling and covers a lot of ground. After all, fairness is a pretty broad concept. Seeing that my time is limited, I'm just going to focus on the most prominent aspect of this charge, the purported exclusion of non-property owning white males from the political process. Now, I have no doubt you're familiar with this one. It goes a little something like this. Much the same way as the founding distinguished white humans from black slaves, it also elevated property-holding white males over everyone else, in particular women and the poor. And it denied all these other people the right to vote. The go-to guy for this view is Howard Zinn, who wrote A People's History of the United States. He says, as many as half the people were not even considered by the founding fathers. They were not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. They were absent in the Constitution. They were invisible in the new political democracy. They were the women of early America. And for the Constitution, this is what he says, it serves the interests of a wealthy elite and acts as a buffer against the blacks, the Indians, the very poor whites. Now, this view is so deeply entrenched that at Heritage, the biggest conservative think tank in the country where I work, practically all my colleagues, when I ask them, what does the Constitution say about who's allowed to vote? They all tell me, white males over the age of 21 who own property. So for all the complaints about civic literacy in this country, it seems that this is one fact that everybody seems to have learned from high school. The problem is that it doesn't square with the real facts. So first of all, as I told you, nowhere in the Declaration or in the Constitution are human beings classified by race, by skin color, by religion, by sex, by gender, you name it. Of course, the Declaration of Independence says all men, but that's a rhetorically powerful way of describing human beings. When the Constitution says that you can't pass an ex post facto law, clearly that doesn't mean that you can pass an ex post facto law on women. That's meant to cover all citizens. Looking to this question of who could actually vote, the Constitution says, does anybody know what the Constitution says on the question of who can vote? It's a pretty important question.
Nothing.
It doesn't say nothing, because I'm Canadian. I'm pretty sure I can't vote. The Constitution... what does the Constitution say? And you guys are American citizens. Who is allowed to vote in federal elections according to the Constitution? Yes?
Those people who are determined to be able to vote by the states.
Correct. So what the Constitution essentially does is it defers to the states. If you're capable of voting in election at the state level for the most numerous branch of the legislature in that state, you get to vote for congressional elections. Now, what did this mean in practice? Who is actually voting in America at the time of the founding? Let's look at Howard Zinn's 3 favorite marginalized groups. First of all, so we'll do blacks, women, and the poor. So I've told you that in theory, at the level of principle, there is no such thing as a property requirement or any such thing. But how did it work in practice? Were blacks voting at the time of the founding? You don't need to raise your hand. You can just tell me yes, no. No. Anybody think that they were? Yes, okay.
But I've heard this before.
Okay, well, you don't know. So let me give you a shocker. Free blacks were voting, as far as I can tell, the historical record is a bit murky. They were voting in 10 of the original 13 states. Georgia and South Carolina clearly stipulated that blacks could not vote. It was only restricted, it was only white people. And Virginia is a little bit unclear. So let me repeat that for you. At the time of the founding, free blacks were voting alongside free whites in elections. I'm not a historian, but I suspect that is a first in recorded history. I can't imagine that ever happening anywhere else. And need I remind you why this happened in America out of all places? Well, you start talking about equality. You start saying that this is the foundational truth at the heart of the country. Well, these ideas start to play themselves out. All men are created equal. What about, so, of course, I want to be clear. Enslaved blacks clearly were not voting. I'm not trying to suggest anything was fine and dandy. I'm trying to get you to call into question the received wisdom you have when you think about the founding, and to give it a second look and to confront it more honestly. What about women? Were women voting at the time of the founding? Well, seeing that I said no to your first answer on the black question, you suspect that this is not what you've heard. In 1797, something happened in New Jersey that had never happened in all of recorded human history. Women voted in an election. And it happened in New Jersey, out of all places. Now, mind you, a few years later, they changed the law, and women were no longer voting. But it is an amazing thing to note. And it's something that few people know. I realize that Wikipedia is not exactly an authority on anything, but the page on voting rights falsely claims that Wyoming was the first state in which women were able to vote. I know, an error on Wikipedia. Next, right? But for the first time in history, women voted in the US. And why did it happen, you think? I think it has to do something with this. What about the poor? Some of the states had property requirements, but these were generally low. As such, if you look at Washington's first term as president, 10 states had either no property requirements or minimal property requirements for voting. Exact numbers are kind of hard to come by, but in these states, at least, 90% of adult males were eligible to vote. And in the states that had higher property requirements, that number was closer to 75%. Now, I mention that for two reasons. One is, I think the impression we all have is that at the time of the founding, 4% of people were voting. And they all had wigs, and that was about it. Secondly, this isn't my ultimate concern to see who was voting or who wasn't voting. The point is to show you that the Constitution clearly does not place these restrictions on voting. Now, one thing you could rightly say is that the Constitution didn't go far enough in securing everybody's right to vote. And that I will grant you that point. And that's why the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments properly complete the Constitution. When we're speaking of the founding, it really ends, in a certain sense, in 1868, with the ratification of the 15th Amendment. That's when finally the founders' vision is realized. So, this one, I would argue, doesn't fly. Let's look at the last one, and then we can have some questions. Now, the founding is outdated. Now, this is the original progressive charge. Woodrow Wilson, in his 1912 election campaign against Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Taft, and Eugene Debs, had a stump speech he would give all across the country. And it was called, "What is Progress?" Let me read to you a couple of quotes from it. Some citizens, this is, by the way, I don't think the best way to get elected, but he seemed to pull it off. Some citizens of this country have never gone beyond the Declaration of Independence, signed in Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776. Their bosoms swell against George III, but they have no consciousness of the war for freedom that is going on today. The Declaration of Independence did not mention the questions of our day. He goes on, living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism, and it must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. All that progressives ask or desire is the permission, in an era when development and evolution are the scientific words, to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. Now, everyone is guilty of this today, including the Heritage Foundation. So this is our little pocket Constitution. We've distributed, I believe, 4 million copies of this. Look at the cover picture. Does this tell you 21st century Constitution, ready to guide you through complicated times? No, it's the same dudes with the wigs again. Now, I know why they put it there, but this is sending the wrong message, that this is an 18th century document. This is kind of the mild, nice, unconscious version. This is the better one. So Time magazine. Last time I checked, still the largest magazine in the country with the largest circulation. They had this cover page story written by Richard Stengel, who's the managing editor, and they published it July 4th, 2011. There's a picture of the Constitution. Do you guys see what it says? Does it still matter? So rather than give you the answer, I'm going to read to you the opening paragraph, and I'll let you guys figure it out. Okay? This is a good one. Here are a few things the framers did not know about. World War II, DNA, sexting, airplanes, the atom, television, Medicare, collateralized debt obligations, the germ theory of disease, miniskirts, the internal combustion engine, computers, antibiotics, and he saved the best for last, Lady Gaga. So there you have it. The Constitution is set aside based on a dozen self-evident chronological platitudes. Can you really take a bunch of dudes who didn't know the lyrics to Poker Face seriously when it comes to politics? Really, people? Now let's be clear. How do you answer this charge? Citizens of all political persuasion who uphold the Constitution, liberals and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, libertarians and socialists, are not pining to turn back the clock on technological advances and social progress and return to the late 18th century. We are not hapless characters in a bad political remake of Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris. This is not Midnight in Philadelphia. When we argue for the enduring relevance of the Constitution, what are we arguing for? We are upholding the Republican small r framework of limited government that it sets in place. The framers may all be dead and gone, but the principles of the Constitution endure. These principles, yes, they were first articulated 2 centuries ago, but they are not tied to the material conditions of a bygone age. They rest on that most solid and enduring of all foundations, human nature. This is what Madison asked in Federalist 51. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? The miniskirt, sexting, and collateralized debt obligations haven't put much of a dent in good old human nature. Until men become angels, let's stick to the Constitution's healthy distrust of concentration of power and unfettered mob rule. Time changes. Issues flare up and drop off the radar. Science continues to deliver wonders. The Constitution is meant to create, if you remember one thing from this talk, remember this one sentence. The Constitution is meant to create a framework for a free people to confront the political questions of their times, whatever they may be. It contains no policy prescriptions. Its words and principles are anchored in the Declaration of Independence. What do? They categorically rule out certain laws, like an ex post facto law. You guys know what that is? You declare something that used to be legal, retroactively illegal. Thereby you can punish someone for having committed a crime when at the time it wasn't a crime. The Constitution says there's a few things you can't do. What else does it do? It creates a system of checks and balances between different levels of government. But within the confines of these restrictions and delineations, it leaves the people entirely free to deliberate via their elected representatives on the questions and problems of the day. And of course, need I remind you, the Constitution can be amended. The Constitution will become outdated if one of 2 things happen. Number 1, human nature changes. Number 2, we no longer want Republican small r self-government. And we either maybe want to set up a monarchy or some form of aristocratic rule by elites. So long as these 2 things don't happen, the Constitution is as relevant today as it was 2 centuries ago, and it will be as it will be 2 centuries from now. And the same thing holds for the Declaration of Independence. If all men are created equal, there's no progress beyond that. You can go backwards when men were not equal, but you can't improve theoretically on the principle of equality. So in conclusion, there you have it. The principles of the founding and the founding documents that still define America. They are not racist. They're not pro-slavery. They are most definitely not unfair to women, the poor, or whatever the marginalized group of the weak is. And they've lost none of their relevance in the past 2 centuries. Now, in addressing these charges, I want to be clear on something. I'm not trying to vindicate the founding at all costs and to convert each and every one of you into strict constitutionalists. In a republic such as ours, citizens are free to question everything, including their founding principles. America is not Sparta or Rome, where we are told that our laws came down to us from the gods. My modest goal is simply to encourage you to properly engage the founding and grapple with its true principles: republicanism, self-government, federalism, the rule of law, rather than to dismiss it offhand for being racist, unfair, and outdated. And on this note, I'd be delighted to take some questions, either because you didn't find my responses to these 3 charges convincing, or because you've heard other things about the founding that you think are perplexing. Thank you. So don't be shy. Ask your or are you also? Yes?
It's not so much a question as, one thing I think is interesting when thinking about this as well is that you consider, I guess, the historical situation in other countries at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because with a lot of these issues, I think when you're talking about slavery, for example, in most Western countries, that wasn't abolished until like the mid-19th century, is that correct?
I believe actually it was abolished beforehand for the simple fact that they didn't have as many slaves. It's like Belgium being very proud that they banned landmines. I mean, so what?
They don't have an army. When would they ever use landmines? It's very easy to do the right thing when no one is opposing you doing the right thing, right? It's like saying, I never killed anybody. Well, did you ever find your wife in bed with another man and have a gun in your hand? Then you can say, I never killed anybody. My point was that America had some real obstacles to abolishing slavery. Some of the other countries, I don't know how well it worked, but they just didn't have the vested slaveholding interest that America had. And it's something we forget, I mean, thankfully, because we don't have slavery today, and no one in his right mind in America would defend this position. But they had to face an uphill battle. Yes?
Quoting Levinson, I believe it was you said that the Constitution has not just been amended 27 times because, I guess, because of judicial activism or just certain the constitutional movements by people.
Correct.
It's
That's
undergone-
Ackerman, actually, the constitutional
You're,
law.
you're right, you're right. It's undergone revision. How would you suggest that judges today interpret the Constitution in light of some of these changes we've seen? Like, for instance, like New Deal era, Great Economist clauses, like this. Can we really go back and return to the original understanding?
Before I answer your question, it's a good question. There's one thing I don't like about it is that, and I'm not saying that's necessarily what you're doing, maybe it's a warning for others. We all have a tendency to believe that what is the job of the Supreme Court? It's to tell us what the Constitution means, right? That you have 3 branches of government. So 2 of them are doing the little thing, but there's this 3rd branch with these 9 really smart people, and their job is to interpret the Constitution. According to the founders, all 3 branches of government have a duty to interpret and uphold the Constitution. Congress can disagree with the Supreme Court. So can the founder. Republican self-government is supposed to be messy, right? We're a free people. We're governing ourselves. It's not supposed to be all well and ordered. So on the one hand, I want to point this out because we have a tendency to think that if only the Supreme Court could hand out right decisions, everything would be okay. No. George Bush, when he signed the McCain-Feingold Campaign Reform Act, he issued a signing statement saying, I'm pretty sure this is not constitutional, but I'm going to let the Supreme Court decide. This is a guy who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. So we need to move away from this Supreme Court centered understanding of our government. Now, in response to your question, I mean, the simple answer is some form of originalism. That there's original public meaning. It's not so much the matter, the intent of the people who passed the law. It's words have meaning in English. This is a free country. There are debates surrounding any amendment. We can have a fairly good idea of what these things meant. Now, there can then be reasonable disagreements, and that's bound to happen in a free country. But that's different than what a living constitution does, is that it seeks to go into the penumbras and recesses of the Constitution to find little rights that no one ever found before. So let's have a robust discussion of what the words on the page mean. Yes?
Kind of, I guess, based on that opinion, do you think that the court is moving more in that direction or moving more against it?
I don't track the court very, very carefully. The work I do is more in pushing Congress to, pardon my French, to grow a pair and to learn to not just sit there and wait for the Supreme Court to tell them what to do. I think it's a mixed bag. On certain things, yes. On other things, no. I'm very curious to see what mood Anthony Kennedy is going to be on in June when they hand a ruling on Obamacare. I think that's going to be interesting. I think it's a mixed bag. The difficulty I find is that you don't get enough justices having their Ginsburg moment. You heard what Justice Ginsburg said in Egypt a few weeks ago? Anybody come across that? She said that if Egyptians are looking for a constitution, they shouldn't turn to the US. It's a bad constitution, it's outdated. Instead, they should look at South Africa, Canada. I think these moments are great because they openly reveal that all this talk of living constitutionalism is bogus. And this person, and Justice Ginsburg in this case, just doesn't like the Constitution. But most of the time what you get from activist judges is the claim of a living constitution, right? We don't want a constitution that is stuck in the 18th century. So we need to reinterpret it and bring it to life in the 21st century. And that's a fairly transparent argument for judicial activism. But that's what you get most of the time, and it confuses the issue. So when they openly say, I don't like the Constitution, it's racist, it's outdated, it's undemocratic, I think that's great because you see where the fault lines are. Yes?
Hi, could you maybe point to specific places in the Constitution where it talks about small government, for example, and
So it never speaks of small government, and there are, I believe, don't quote me on this, maybe only 2 or 3 references to the government in the Constitution. What the Constitution creates is different branches of government. It doesn't create a monolithic state based on the Germanic model of a centralized administration. It creates a Congress in Article 1, it creates a president in Article 2, and a system of courts in Article 3. Now, what's the word you said? Where does it speak of a limited government?
or small government?
Small.
That is
Well,
one
so,
of the
so, I
principles
mean,
of Harris.
look at Article 1, Section 1. You have it in front of you. What are the very first words? All legislative powers herein granted. You see that? Contrast that with Article 2, Section 1. The executive power. Article 3, Section 1. The judicial power. You see the difference? It doesn't say all executive powers herein granted. It doesn't say all judicial powers herein granted. It only says all legislative powers herein granted. Congress only has authority over certain areas that is granted to it by the people. Article 1, Section 8 is a list of the 18 areas over which Congress has power. And the nicest summation of it all is the 10th Amendment. Do you know what it says? The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. So the federal government, which is not even a word that exists in the Constitution, only has the powers that are delegated to it. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in recovering the founders' Constitution is to remember what this means. I mean, this is such a key concept, federalism. It's so important to understanding the vision that the founders had. So on the one hand, you have a national government that is tasked with certain things, and then you've got 50 state governments doing different things, little laboratories of democracy. The problem with this is that it was grossly abused by southern states in the Jim Crow era to justify segregation. And people in the federal government didn't have a proper understanding of the Constitution to push back against it. And to say that the 14th Amendment does not allow you to do what you're doing to black people. So this became a discredited notion. People today think it means states' rights, you want to justify segregation or Jim Crow or certain things. Part of our mission and heritage is to recover a proper understanding of federalism. One that is grounded in a distinction between the areas that are of legitimate concern to the national government and all the other areas that are left to the states, where you get literally laboratories of democracy. So maybe one state wants more social services and higher taxes, well, let them have it. Another state doesn't. So you don't see the word small government, but one of the key principles is the idea of a government that is of limited enumerated powers. Does that make sense? We got room time maybe for a couple more? Well, both of you, one at a time, whichever order you want.
So were some of these problems also present in the Articles of Confederation?
The Articles of Confederation were a catastrophe. The only people I've met who like them are crazy libertarians who think that the Constitution gave us big government and that the solution is to go back to the Articles of Confederation. The most eloquent and concise argument for why they were a complete failure is Federalist 15 to 22. So 8 Federalist Papers, an extended argument of everything that was wrong with the Federalist paper, with the government created under the Articles of Confederation. Basically, it wasn't even a government. It was completely weak. It couldn't do anything. The states were horribly misbehaving. The federal government could do nothing. Spain closed off shipping in the Mississippi. We couldn't do anything about it. I mean, it's a huge flaw. The only thing that we lost out on, but this is a personal thing of mine, is that there was a clause in there saying that Canada could join the U.S. if it wanted to. And that's no longer in the Constitution, much to my dismay. Yes? Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of a little bit too small, the government's a little bit too
It's
small.
not a matter of the size, it's a matter of the energy.
Okay.
If you read the Federalist Papers, they don't speak of the size of government. They say it needs to have the appropriate energy to carry out the ends that are entrusted to it. The 18 articles, the 18 clauses in Article 1, Section 8, right? The government needs to establish post roads, for example. Well, it needs to be capable of doing that. It's a matter of giving it the proper means to accomplish its legitimate ends. The Articles of Confederation stated all these ends, but the means were grossly inadequate. Sir?
I don't support this, but in fact, I tend to agree with you. But there are those that would argue that we should just throw out the Constitution and start over. How would you respond to those that want to just like draft a new?
Well, I'll respond in one of two ways. So first of all, I'll say I disagree with you. I think it's a bad idea. I think this is a sound document. I think it creates a really sound framework for free people to govern themselves. I would argue we should keep it. Ultimately, if I'm in the minority and they muster, 80% of the population to agree with them, then yeah, change it. The people are sovereign in America. We the people. Not we the Constitution, not we the government. If the vast majority of the people who are the collective sovereign want to have a new Constitution, I mean, who's to stop them, right? I think it's worth preserving. I think, both for conservatives and liberals, I think this is a sound document for people to govern themselves. If ultimately I end up being a lone dissenting voice, well, I mean, that's what it means to live in a free country, right? These laws didn't come down to us from the gods. This is not Sparta or Rome, as I told you guys. So if the people want to change them, well, you change them. Maybe one last one? Your soul? So look, really, I'll just leave you on this note. Don't buy into this if you want. Don't become a conservative. Don't vote Republican. That's not what I came to tell you. Maybe you don't even like the founding or the Constitution, but please, at the very least, do it the courtesy of reading it honestly and not dismissing it for being racist, unfair, and outdated. Thank you very much.
Well, as we close our evening, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming and give a thanks again to the Dartmouth Review and Poly Talk. As I mentioned up front, I direct our Young Leaders program at Heritage, so I have the great pleasure of overseeing all of our youth outreach efforts at Heritage. So as you heard our talk tonight and are just interested in maybe learning a little bit more what we do at Heritage, I'd encourage you to pull out your phones and like Heritage on Facebook. You can search Heritage Foundation Young Leaders Program. So we do daily posts, and that can keep you up to date on the papers, the research, everything that's what we're working on here at Heritage. If you're really interested in diving more on the issue, I'm going to pass around some sign-up sheets. We do a weekly e-newsletter, which allows you to dive even more in onto these issues and really see what David and our other colleagues are working with at Heritage. So make sure to find a sheet and put your name on there before you leave. And then for those of you who are really young future policy analysts or those who want to come to DC and become part of our program, I'd really encourage you to check out our internship program. Sterling's one of our Dartmouth alum from last summer, and we want to continue that trend of bringing great students to Washington, D.C. Our program is the best program you can take part of. You get to come to D.C. and you partner up with one of our individual departments. So for those of you who are policy wonks and want to see what it's like to work on a specific issue, you can get partnered up with someone like David or one of our tax policy analysts and focus in for the semester. If you're like myself, maybe more business oriented, we have internships and everything from accounting to IT to youth outreach to development. So whatever your area of study can be, it's a great opportunity to come to DC and get practical experience in that field. And it's not just about that day-to-day experience. We really invest in you at your time in Heritage. It's a lecture series. David's office puts together a great series of first principles luncheons. We do practical skills training, so you work on your resume, your public speaking. So you're not just getting all those fun educational lectures, but you're investing in yourself and growing throughout your time in Heritage. So it is paid. I know that's a great question everyone asks, but it's a great paid opportunity. I handed some flyers out so all of you can pop through there. My contact information's on there. So if you ever have any questions about wanting to hand out 50 pocket constitutions to help us reach 5 million, or in learning more about our internship program, feel free to email and stay connected. But thanks again to Dartmouth Review and Polytalk, and David and I are happy to stay around and answer any more questions you have. Thanks for coming.